and welcome to the latest episode of KRAD COVID Readings. I'm Keith R.A. DeCandido, and I voted today. You should vote too. Do early voting, do mail-in voting, do vote on November 3rd, whatever it is, just please vote. Lots of people died so you'd have the right to have a voice in your government, and you should exercise that right, especially this year. It's very important. Anyway, please vote. Today, I am going to be reading Gan Brightblade versus Mitos the Mighty, which is a story set in the universe of Dragon Precinct, and is both a prequel and a sequel to this novel. In this novel, it introduced the fantasy police procedural world that I have created of Flingaria, in which our heroes are two detectives who have to solve the murders of members of a heroic quest, a party of adventurers straight out of any D&D game. 4 of them are killed before Torn and Denthers finally figure out who the murderer is. And one of the stories that I did after this was a story I did through Kickstarter. I've actually crowdfunded several stories, particularly in the Dragon Precinct universe, including this one, which is called Gan Brightblade versus Mitos the Mighty, and is about storytelling and about one of Gan and his friends' past adventures and all kinds of other cool stuff. It was originally released only to Kickstarter supporters, and then it was reprinted in the eSpec Books edition of Dragon Precinct. eSpec is actually the 3rd publisher to publish this book. This book was originally published in 2004 by Simon & Schuster in mass market, and then the imprint it was part of was discontinued. Dark Quest Books picked up the series in 2011, and they reprinted Dragon Precinct in trade paperback. And then Dark Quest kind of fell into the swamp in 2017, and eSpec Books picked it up. They reprinted all the previous editions and then published Mermaid Precinct. And we'll be publishing the subsequent books in the series, Phoenix Precinct, Manticore Precinct, and more Tales from Dragon Precinct. But they also reprinted all the previous volumes, and one of the bonus features they did in their edition was to have short stories in the back. And in the case of the eSpec edition of Dragon Precinct, it was the first ever actual printing beyond the Kickstarter supporters of Gan Brightblade versus Mitos the Mighty. So without further ado, here's the story. We begin with its epigraph, Si non è vero, e ben trovato, which is an Italian proverb which translates to, although not true, it's still a good story. Part the first, Valessa. Now I bring to you the tale of Gan Brightblade and how he and his comrades finally vanquished Mitos the Mighty. Mitos was the last of the tyrant wizards whose madness had plagued Flingaria for centuries. Shortly after the end of the Elven Wars and the death of the Elf Queen, word reached the human hero Gan Brightblade that Mitos had taken over the village of Shale's Haven. Brightblade was in the Dwarven lands, receiving the Brave Diamond for courage in battle during the Elven Wars. Presenting him with the diamond was his comrade in arms, the Dwarven general, Ubarlig. Elsewhere, Althar Lothsirhan's powerful mage, and cousin to the now deceased Elf Queen, though still living in exile right here in Valessa, also received word of Mitos's treachery. Brightblade, Althar, Ubarlig, and 4 other great heroes, Bog, the barbarian from the north, Brother Genero, a priest of Temisa, and the twin halflings Mary and Nari, had faced Mitos many times, individually and collectively. They defeated him at Storm's Pass, and at the forest of Nimvale, and on Gustav Isle. But the final defeat was still to come. Using his great magic, Althar gathered the heroes together in Treemark, the nearest city to Shale's Haven. Bringing the party to the village itself was not possible, as Mitos had warded the town against anyone else's spells. They set forth, arriving at Shale's Haven, only to find it utterly destroyed. Not a structure was left standing, not a person left alive. The massive statue of the town's founder, the great Shale Holm, lay broken in pieces in the village square. Of Mitos, there was no sign. For a time, not one of the group of heroes said a word. Even the voluble halfling twins were rendered mute. Until Brightblade spoke. Enough of this! For years we have fought and chased this damnable wizard. Even as we have defeated Chalmrake the Foul and the evil Huang, still Mitos remains at large. We have failed to defeat him in the past, and it has led to this! Genero nodded. I swear, in Temisa's name, that I will not rest until the lives of the residents of Shale's Haven are avenged. Althar then added his own oath. The good name of wizards everywhere will never be clean until this scourge is removed. Ubarlig held up his Fjorm axe, a gift from Brightblade. Then let us be off and destroy him once and for all before he commits such atrocities again. The party ventured forth, Althar able to trace Mitos using his magic. Eventually they tracked him to a redoubt located in the Lana Mountains. As they approached the base of the mountain, Brightblade said, "We must be wary, my good friends. Mitos would not have chosen this mount as his base of operations without fortifying it." "We'll be wary, Gan. Worry not," Althar said. When they first arrived, the halfling twins discovered a hidden door and were able to gain ingress. Immediately upon their entry, though, they were ravaged by a swarm of blood-sucking bats intent on sucking the very life's blood of any who dared enter Mitos' sanctum. But these bats were demonic creatures of evil, and therefore Brother Genero was able to dispel them with a quick prayer to his goddess. His piety rewarded, the bats scattered to the winds. The heroes continued into the caves, light provided by torches. They walked around the stalagmites that jutted out from the cave floor, but one of them was a rockworm in disguise. As the intrepid heroes passed by the seeming stalagmite, it shivered and grew, rumbling out of the ground and attacking the halflings and Ubarlik. But before anyone even realized what was happening, the dwarven general swung his mighty Fjorm axe and smashed the foul creature into tiny rocks. More traps awaited them. The twins discovered a trapdoor that would have plunged all of them to their doom on a bed of spikes. A cube of jelly encased the barbarian, and Althar was forced to use his magics to freeze it before Bog ran out of air. The loincloth-wearing brute from the north repaid the favor Althar did him. A siren appeared and ensorcelled the elven mage. Suddenly, Althar turned on his comrades, blasting them with fireballs and lightning strikes before Bog was able to cut the woman's head off, thus freeing Althar from sorcerer's bondage. After Genero healed the wounds inflicted by Althar, the elf turned to face the stalactites. "I am coming for you, Mitos. No more shall you use your foul minions to do your dirty work. It is you for whom we have come today, and we shall not depart until your corpse lies at our feet." Mitos' response was to send a horde of hobgoblins at them. But Gan Brightblade hefted his weapon, the shining jewel known and feared throughout Flingaria, the slayer of the tyrant Kamnar and the last of the black dragons, the great sword Monsterbane. He cleaved a path through the creatures, single-handedly slaying them all before they could even reach any of Brightblade's comrades. Within moments, Monsterbane dripped with the blood of a dozen dead hobgoblins. Beyond the hobgoblins lay a massive room carved out of the great rock of the mountain. The twins urged Brightblade to wait, that they may check for traps, but the great hero had lost all patience. "Mitos has sent his minions and his traps. He fears us. No longer shall we be frightful and cautious, but we shall sally forth and face Mitos man to man." With that, Brightblade ran into the cavern, Monsterbane raised high over his head. Sure enough, he saw their foe before him. Mitos the Mighty used his magic to float in the center of the large space, lightning flashing from his arms and legs. "So, Gan Brightblade, we meet again. For so long I have led you around like a fool in a maze, but after all these years you have at last found me again." "Only long enough to end you once and for all, braggart!" Mitos smiled then. "That is what you said the last time, fool, at the forest of Nimvale." "Yes, you hid behind hobgoblins then, too, but not this time. This time we will be victorious!" And then all 7 of them ran into the cavern. Brightblade charged directly at the wizard, followed quickly by Ubarlig and the barbarian. The wizard hung back as Althar needed to prepare his spells, while the halfling stayed in the shadows, waiting for an opportune moment to strike. The priest of Temisa also stayed back, for now he prayed. The goddess had favored Brother Genero on more than one occasion, and the priest was hopeful that this would be another such. And to his joy, his prayers were answered. Temisa granted each member of the party greater strength. Brightblade's sword cut through the wizard's magical defenses, and the hero of Flingaria was able to wound the mage. But Mitos was not so easily stopped. Bleeding though he was, he cast Brightblade aside, but then he found himself under dual attack by both the barbarian and the dwarf. While he was able to dispatch the barbarian with ease, Ubarlik was not so easily defeated, and Mitos found himself with a Fjorm axe embedded in his arm. Now bleeding from 2 wounds, 2 more wounds than Brightblade and his companions had ever managed to give the mage in the past, Mitos was barely able to muster a defense against Althar's lightning strikes. But so focused was he on those that he did not see the halflings sneak behind him and throw their daggers into his back. Mitos collapsed to the rocky floor. Never had he been so battered. They continued to attack one by one, the goddess Temisa's power aiding and multiplying their own. Bog, Ubarlig, and Brightblade hammered at the evil wizard with their weapons, and Althar continued his magical attack. "No!" the wizard cried. "I am Mitos the Mage. I am Mitos the Mighty. I will not be defeated by you or by anyone!" Brightblade approached the prone form of his foe. "You are wrong, mage, as you have been wrong so many times in the past. Now the spirits of those you massacred in Shale's Haven shall be avenged!" And then he raised Monsterbane over his head and brought it down hard, cleaving Mitos the Mighty's head from his body, ending his scourge once and for all. So at last, the plague of mad wizards was finally at an end. Chalmrake the Foul, Huang, and now Mitos the Mighty, all brought low by Gan Brightblade and his noble comrades. May their names ring out forevermore as great heroes of Flingaria. The crowd in the slaughtered basilisk in Valessa approached Medinn as the bard finished telling the tale of Gan Brightblade's final battle against Mitos the Mighty. Medinn took a small bow and pointed at the basket at his feet. "Thank you, everyone. If you enjoyed the presentation, please feel free to donate a coin or two." The owner of the slaughtered basilisk, a very good woman named Tina, paid him well, but the tips were always appreciated. Besides, he often found his best jobs from people who came up to tip him and ask him questions. Sure enough, several patrons moved toward the back of the bar from where he'd been telling his tale. "That was a great story," said one very young human who tipped 2 silvers. "I especially liked the part where Brightblade cut the wizard's head off." "It was enjoyable," said an older dwarf who tipped a copper, "but I would have preferred to hear more of what the people had to say. Oh, the speeches we did here were quite fine. I especially like what Ubarlig said. Great man he is." "Do you perform at weddings?" asked a gnome who tipped 5 coppers. "I ask only because my cousin is getting married in the middle of next month in Iaran, and—" Reluctantly, Medinn cut him off. Sorry, but for most of the next month I'll be farther north. King Tombi's son is coming of age, and for some reason he wants a bard there. In fact, I'm leaving for the North Country in the morning." The gnome was taken aback, as indeed Medinn had been when he'd received the commission. "I'm surprised King Tombi knows what a bard is." "So was I," Medinn smiled. "Thank you, and I'm sorry I can't help you with your cousin's wedding." "Now, that's all right. That'll probably be awful, and I mostly asked only so I knew there would be at least one part of the wedding that wouldn't be." "Well, good luck," Medinn said, by way of getting the gnome to move along so someone else could come up to the tip basket. "Thing is, I really like my cousin, but—" he sighed. "Ah, well." The gnome finally wandered off. A human in the red robes of a Temisan priest approached. The robes were more worn than Medinn expected. Priests usually kept their raiment immaculate. However, what the priest lacked in clothing, he made up for in generosity. He dropped 2 gold into the basket. Eyes wide, Medinn opened his mouth to express his gratitude, but when he looked at the priest in question, he found he could only make a strangled noise. In a soft voice, the priest said, "You told the story very well." Thank you," Medinn managed to stammer out. You're... The priest smiled. "Yes, I am in fact Brother Genero of Valessa. And if you permit me, I would be most grateful if you would allow me to buy you a drink, so I may tell you everything you got wrong in your story." "Excuse me?" Medinn asked, more than a little nonplussed. "Your story. I'm afraid many of the details were exaggerated at best, wholly false at worst." He sighed. "Look, I know that Brightblade's sword wasn't really called Monsterbane, but everyone thinks it was called that. Whenever I leave that detail out, half the audience comes up to me afterward and tells me, 'You know, Brightblade's sword was called Monsterbane. You should really include that the next time you tell the story.'" Genero actually provided a gentle chuckle at that. "Yes, I can imagine how that might be problematic for you. However, I regret to say that there are further inaccuracies." "I see." Medinn had really been hoping it was just about the stupid sword. Give me a moment, and I'll join you for that drink." "Of course." Genero bowed and returned to his table. Medinn went back to the privy. He always downed an ale before starting a story, which meant he always had to pee at the end of it. When he returned, there were far fewer people in the tavern. On the one hand, he was grateful that so many people had come specifically to hear him. On the other, he was hoping for Tina's sake that more people would stick around and drink more. The smaller crowd made it easier to find Brother Genero, who sat at a table in the corner, his braided red chin beard touching its surface. Like all priests of Temisa, Genero was clean-shaven all over his head, aside from the chin beard and a tiny patch of hair on his crown tied into a topknot. Medinn was grateful that the crowd during his performance was sufficiently large that he hadn't been able to tell that one of the subjects of his tale was listening to it. He hated telling stories that members of the audience had actually experienced. It made him nervous and concerned that he would get important details wrong, which, according to Genero, he had. Standing behind the bar, Tina waved Medinn over to her. Casting a quick glance at Genero, Medinn then changed direction and headed to the bar that was on the opposite wall from where the priest sat. "Great crowd tonight, Medinn. Thank you." Medinn winced, "But most of them left when I was done." "So?" Tina shrugged. "They drank like fishes while they were here, and that's what matters. Here." She reached out with her left hand and grabbed Medinn's right arm, turning it so that his right hand was palm up. Then she dropped a gold piece into that hand. "Consider this a bonus." Eyes widening, Medinn said, "Tina, I can't." "Yes, you can. We did more than well enough." "You say so." Medinn bowed his head and placed the coin in his money pouch. "Now, if you'll excuse me, one of the patrons wants to buy me a drink." He didn't particularly want to share with Tina that the subject of the conversation over that drink was going to be his failings as a storyteller. One of the waitresses, who was new to the tavern since Medinn was here last, came over as he joined the priest. "What can I get you, gentlemen?" Genero gave Medinn an expectant look, and the bard said, "I'll have an ale, please." "The same," the priest said, with what Medinn thought was an approving nod. Medinn started off with a lie. "I wish I'd known you were here, brother." Shaking his head, Genero said, "I did not wish it. I only recently came back home, and it is not for a pleasant reason. Be that as it may, I wish to discuss your story with you. First, let me assure you that you told it brilliantly. I was captivated by your delivery of the tale, even if I was disheartened by the inaccuracies." Placated a bit by that, Medinn nodded his head. "Thank you." The waitress came back with the ales. Genero held his up. "To your fine storytelling." Medinn did likewise. "To you, Gan Brightblade, and the rest of your comrades, without whom I would have had no tale to tell." They clinked their glasses together, and then each sipped. Medinn thought the ale tasted more bitter than his before-show drink had, which probably meant that Tina had gotten out another barrel. Apparently it really had been a good night. "I'm afraid," Genero said after wiping his lips with the sleeve of his robe, "that the first mistake you made was right at the very beginning. The Elven Wars still raged when we faced Mitos in the mountain. It was 13 years ago, and Gan wasn't in Dwarf Country to receive an award. He was there with Ubarlig to recruit more Dwarven troops to fight against the Elf Queen." Medinn nearly choked on his ale at that one. The bard had expected to get some details wrong, beyond the name of Brightblade's sword, that is, and others were embellishments done for the purposes of storytelling. In particular, the dialogue was, he was certain, wholly inaccurate. After a few coughs, he swallowed his ale. "Really? I must say, brother, this astonishes me. Every version of the story I've heard over the past decade has it taking place after the Elf Queen's death." Genero nodded. Indeed, part of why Althar was so eager to embark on a pursuit of Mitos at this time was because he had just implemented a covert attack against his cousin, and he thought it wise to be as far from the front lines as possible. Mind you, Gan did receive the Brave Diamond, with not just Ubarlig by his side, but also the twins and myself, but that was 3 years after we defeated Mitos. "I see." Medinn took a thoughtful sip of his ale. "When we arrived at Shale's Haven, we were indeed reduced to a long silence that was broken by Gan, but he was the only one who spoke. Neither Ubarlig nor Althar said a word, and I can assure you that had he said anything, Althar's words would never have been on the subject of the honor of wizards, a matter about which he cared not a whit." That last was said with a sly smile. "As for me, I did indeed invoke Temisa, but to myself, not aloud. It was, I admit, rather eerie to hear you put into words something I never said." Worried, Medinn quickly said, "My apologies, brother, The priest held up a hand. "Fear not. I took no offense. In any event, as I said, only Gan spoke." Medinn sighed. "I assume Gan's words were incorrect?" Given the bombast of the words in question, Medinn had always assumed that they were not accurate, though they fit the mode of the story. But Genero shook his head. No, what you recited matched my recollection of Gan's utterances that day." Knowing what he knew of Brightblade from the many stories he'd both heard and told about the great hero of Lingaria, Medinn supposed that he couldn't be all that surprised that he really talked like that. "As for the battle itself, the bats we encountered were not demonic, and I did nothing to dispel them. As a matter of fact, they simply swarmed out of the cave when Mary and Nari opened the passageway and flew off into the skies. I suspect they had been trapped there by Mitos' magics and were glad to be free. Nonetheless, they did us no harm, and were not banished by my hand." Medinn was disappointed at that, but said nothing. He'd probably leave that part of the story be, as the truth made for a poor story. Now Genero again smiled slyly. As for the rockworm, I'm afraid that was a stalagmite. We were all rather jumpy, and Ubarlig thought he saw the stalagmite move. He immediately attacked it with his axe, smashing it to pieces, as you described, but it was just harmless rock. Actually, that proved a balm, in a way. Frowning, Medinn asked, how is one of the heroes of Flingaria being a fool a balm? Oh, rest assured, my friend, we all had our moments of embarrassment and stupidity, myself more than anyone. His voice trailed off, and for a moment Genero got a faraway look in his eyes. But then he returned his gaze to Medinn. In any case, we were, as I said, very jumpy. The destruction of Shale's Haven disturbed us all. Even Bog, who had seen far worse in his time. Ubarlig smashing a harmless rock to pieces gave all of us a laugh that we desperately needed. And no one laughed longer and harder than Ubarlig himself, particularly once Bog asked him derisively if he thought it was a rockworm in disguise. That would be where the story of it being a rockworm in disguise probably originated, Medinn said with a nod. No doubt. Genero took another sip of his ale. As for the rest of the journey through the caves to reach Mitos, I'm afraid you made that much more of an adventure than it actually was. Mary and Nary did find a trapdoor that hid a collection of spikes, and we did encounter a siren, but she ensorcelled Bog, and it was Althar who saved him, not the other way around. Medinn was starting to wonder if any of the story he told was actually true or not. The cube? The hobgoblins? Oh, we did encounter such when facing Mitos, just not on that particular occasion. 2 years prior to our final battle, we thought we had traced Mitos to a castle outside Treemark, though we only encountered his minions, who had laid several traps for us. One such was the cube in question, which did imprison Bog, as you said, and Althar did free him by freezing the cube, allowing Gan and Ubarlig to shatter it. As for the hobgoblins, Mitos sent those after us in the forest of Nimvale. Genero shuddered. Even the finest laundry spell couldn't get the smell of those creatures out of my robes. Well, I'm sorry I got so much wrong, brother. I promise... But Genero held up a hand. Please, there is no need to apologize. I should be thanking you. It is rare that a bard allows the opportunity for such a critique. And in truth, I do understand that the needs of your profession do require a certain amount of exaggeration. Many of my fellow bards feel, Medinn said slowly, that truth is a poor excuse for getting in the way of a good story. But I feel that our job is to preserve history, and that requires at least an attempt at accuracy. Worry not, my friend. Your account was accurate in spirit, if not the details. However, while the other details are such that you may amend them or not as you see fit, there is one final inaccuracy that I must insist you excise from any further use of this narrative. It took Medinn a moment to realize that Genero was threatening him. He spoke in the same quiet, even tone he'd been using all along, so Medinn didn't quite register the menace in the priest's words until a few seconds after he said them. There was no prayer on my part to boost the strength of my fellows. I asked Tamisa for that boon once, in one of my earliest adventures alongside Gan and Althar, and I will never make that request again. The price was far too great. Once more Genero got that faraway look in his eyes, and then he again came back to the present, and stared with a renewed intensity at Medinn, so much so that when the bard found it impossible to look away or even blink. Whatever strength we showed on that day was entirely our own. And in truth, it was the efforts of Gan, Althar, and the twins in particular that saved the day and destroyed Mitos. Mary and Nary got us into the mountain and discovered the trapdoor. Althar dispatched the siren, and it was Gan's strong right hand, as well as the backstabbing done by the halflings, which weakened Mitos enough to be vulnerable to Althar's magics. Then, finally, Genero looked away, and only then did Medinn realize he'd been holding his breath. He snatched his ale mug and downed the rest of it in one gulp. I do appreciate your words, brother, and I thank you for the drink. He rose unsteadily to his feet. I'm afraid I must take my leave of you now. I have a long journey ahead of me in the morning. With that, Medinn headed toward the front of the tavern, which led to the foyer and the staircase upstairs, where his room awaited him. Part the second, King Tombi's Land. The caravan that left Valessa the day after Medinn's performance of Gan Brightblade's battle against Mitos the Mighty took a week to reach Barlin, the northernmost of the human city-states that were under the dominion of King Marcus and Queen Marta. There were no caravans to King Tomby's realm, so the bard had to rent a horse and hope that the roads on the map they gave him were accurate. After 10 days, he arrived at a collection of huts on a plateau right as the sun was starting to set. It was absurdly cold, yet he saw men and women wearing animal skin clothing that barely covered their persons. Medinn was shivering in his wool cloak while these people were half naked. As he neared the village, 2 men with spears approached him. One bellowed, "Don't move or we'll shove this spear right up your ass!" Medinn swallowed. I'm Medinn the Bard. I was commissioned..." The other one stepped in front of the first one. "About damn time you showed up. The king was starting to get pissed." I'm sorry, but nobody told me you were on such a high hill, or that it'd be this cold. I couldn't go too fast or I'd risk my mount." One of the men grabbed the reins of his horse. Yeah, whatever. Come on, let's move. We gotta get you to the feast, right now." Medinn blinked. "Now? I was hoping for some rest before..." "We've been feasting for 3 nights waiting for you. We ain't got enough food for another night's feast." Medinn had never heard of a feast that lasted longer than a single evening. The 2 men led his mount through a collection of huts of varying sizes and quality of construction. Some of them barely seemed able to keep the elements out. Not that anyone here seemed to care about exposure to the elements. King Tomby's emissary paid him 50 gold up front, with the promise of another 100 if the king was satisfied with his performance. The emissary's tone indicated that the king not being satisfied with his performance was an option he should avoid. Expecting to be led into a large hut where this alleged feast was taking place, he was instead taken past them, through a line of trees, to a huge clearing that was filled with benches and people shouting and eating and drinking and laughing. Pole-mounted torches bordered the entire clearing, providing illumination against the dusk and coming night. "Wait here," one of the men said, and he ran off toward the largest of the tables, which was on the far side of the clearing. The other man stayed by Medinn and his horse. The wait was interminable. Medinn really had to pee, and at the same time was very thirsty, though he was afraid to even touch his canteen for fear of reprisal from the man with his spear. None of the revelers were paying the least bit attention to him, which wasn't really a surprise. Medinn wasn't very tall or very broad or very distinctive looking. People rarely ever noticed him, at least until he started telling stories. He was listened to when he told stories in ways he never was when he just talked. Finally, the other man came back. "Come on, Bard, you're up. Get down from there. But Ferd here will take care of your horse, right, Ferd?" "Yeah, sure," Ferd said with a distinct dearth of enthusiasm. "The horse is a rental?" Medinn said tentatively as he dismounted. "And please be careful with my things." His travel supplies were of the finest quality, as he believed no expense should be spared when it came to items used while sleeping in the open, and would be prohibitively expensive to replace, not to mention how awful the journey back to civilization would be without them. "It'll be fine," the man said with more confidence than Medinn felt, practically yanking the bard through the crowds of northerners. A huge man sat at the center of the large table at the far end of the clearing. Besides the fact that he was larger than anyone else here, and that was going some, he wore a bearskin cloak, the headpiece of which was the bear's actual head. It made the man look as if he was being eaten by the bear. Figuring that the only way he would be allowed to look so absurd and not be laughed at by this crowd was to actually be King Tomby, Medinn bowed low and said, "Your Majesty." "Don't give me that southern politeness shit, Bard. We don't bow here unless it's to pick something up off the floor." Noticing the large amounts of food, cutlery, pottery shards, and teeth on the ground around him, Medinn couldn't imagine that picking things up off the floor was something that happened a lot, but he wisely kept that to himself. "You ready to tell your story? I expected you 2 days ago." "My apologies, Your Majesty. I came straight from Valessa, but..." Tomby waved a massive hand. "No matter. You're here now. That's what counts. If you arrived tomorrow after the feasting was done, I'd have had to kill you, of course. But having recitations ending the feasting is only fitting, I'd say." He indicated the appallingly skinny boy to his right. "This is my boy, Awful. This is all in his honor." This time Medinn just inclined his head. "A pleasure, Orful, and congratulations." "Are you a real bard?" Orful asked in a thin, reedy voice. Why did they always ask that? Was there a rash of false bards roaming around Flingaria that he was unaware of? Absolutely. I just came from Valessa, where I performed several engagements, and before that, I was the featured bard at the Blue Moon Festival in Treemark. And from here, I'm off to Cliff's End to perform for Lady Mirka's birthday. That last was the commission he'd received in Barlin. Lord Alban had died, and his son, Lord Blake, was planning a birthday celebration for his mother, the late Lord's widow, next month. "Do you know any stories about the Pirate Queen?" Medinn was about to answer in the affirmative. They were some of his favorites to tell. But King Tomby rolled his eyes. "For shit's sake, boy, not that again. I told you, sailors are just weedy types who can't handle dry land like real men. It's my coming of age, Father, and I wish to hear about the Pirate Queen. Tomby took a bite of meat, then said while chewing, All right, fine, that could be one of the stories. Anyway, we best get started before everyone's too drunk to stay awake. Medinn winced. He had forgotten that part of the commission was to tell as many stories as the guest of honor wished. May I make 2 requests, please? You can make them, the king said slowly. I need to urinate before beginning, as my bladder is quite full. And I would also like a flagon of ale before I start. That prompted an uproarious laugh from the king. Of course! Gotta empty and refill. Besides, you got a lot of catching up to do. You can use one of the trees over there. Unsurprised that these people didn't even have proper privies, but just peed on whatever flora was available, Medinn found the largest tree he could and walked behind it so he could relieve himself. When he returned, he accepted the very large flagon of ale that was thrust into his hands by one of the women. Saying a brief prayer to Wyatt, he took a long gulp. Over the decade that Medinn had been a bard, he traveled all up and down Flingaria. His habit of having an ale before each performance had exposed him to a multitude of ales, from the bitter brews found in dwarf country, to the lighter barley-flavored ales of the south, to the specialty-flavored ales you could obtain in some of the finer establishments in Cliff's End. So Medinn could say with resounding firmness and authority that this was, by far, the worst ale he'd ever had in his life, and quite possibly the worst ale ever brewed in the history of the world. It took every ounce of willpower he possessed to keep from throwing it back up after swallowing it, and as he was, he gagged twice. That, of course, prompted a laugh from King Tomby. That's a wallop, doesn't it, Bard? That's one way of putting it, yes, Medinn managed to utter. The king then nodded to someone at the far end of the table. A moment later, Medinn was startled out of 10 years of life by the bleating of a high-pitched horn that sliced through the boisterous noise of Orphal's feast. By the time the single piercing note finished echoing through the clearing, all noise had ceased, save for the occasional sound made by masticating, swallowing, or belching. King Tomby was standing now. As you all know, we have been celebrating my boy Orphal's coming of age. He has bedded his first woman, fashioned his first weapon, and completed his first solo hunt, the end result of which was the 3rd course of this feast. That prompted ragged cheers from the crowd. He still must walk the gauntlet, but as always, the last step before the gauntlet is the feast. More cheers at that. As the cheers died down, though, King Tomby grew serious. Flingaria is changing. More and more humans are moving north as their filthy cities become overcrowded. We came north to get away from that, but it's just following us. Because of that, Orphal's been learning about those shit-suckers to the south, and he told me he wanted a bard for his feast. So I got him one, because he's my son, and this is his coming of age, and because someday he will rule this land. So here he is, a bard. The applause that greeted Medinn's rather lackluster introduction was muted and leavened with jeers and snorts of derision. Thank you, he said with as little sarcasm as he could manage. I hope this night's storytelling will bring you all a maximum of pleasure and enjoyment and a minimum of shit-sucking. That actually got several laughs, including one from the king, which prompted more people to laugh as well. Relieved that that actually worked, Medinn said, The king's son has requested a story of the Pirate Queen, so I shall begin with that. He proceeded to tell the story of the Pirate Queen and how she evaded the armada led by Captain Lothathrior. Orphal was enraptured by the story, and a few of the men were also captivated, but the majority of the crowd apparently shared King Tomby's disdain for seafarers. Undaunted, Medinn followed that with a story about Rug the Wanderer and his vicious battle against a mighty golden dragon. They liked that one better, so he followed it with a tale of the quest for the scepter of Kylie. Then King Tomby said, Do you know the tale of how a millennium ago we killed our gods? Medinn actually smiled at that. He was also somewhat unsteady on his feet at this point, as he was exhausted, his mouth was dry, he was tipsy from the awful ale, which he only kept drinking due to the lack of alternatives, but the story of how Tarkor and Gantha killed the gods of the north atop Mount Garm was one of the first ones he had learned during his apprenticeship to the great bard Rosen Haz. The applause after he told that story was the loudest of the night, and he hoped that that would be the end of it. Where could he possibly go from one of the favorite and most told tales in all the northern lands? That question was quickly answered when Orphal said, I would like to hear one last story. Medinn's relief that this was to be the final story warred with his annoyance that he had yet another to tell. But aloud he said, Whatever the guest of honor requests. With a look down at the person sitting at the far end of the table, Medinn honestly wasn't sure which of the people at that end of the table it was, Orphle said, "I want to hear the story of how Gan Brightblade and his companions defeated Mitos the Mighty." That actually got a huge cheer from the crowd, though it was even more ragged than the earlier cheers, due to the extreme drunkenness and fatigue of everyone present, including Medinn. Nonetheless, he took a gulp of the wretched ale and told the story again. He was mindful of Genero's corrections, and so he began the story by telling of the group's previous battles against Mitos, mentioning the cube of jelly in the castle outside Treemark and the hobgoblins in the forest of Nimvale. He corrected the timeline to the waning days of the Elven Wars, and had the Siren and Sorcel bog so the barbarian, who, he mused, probably came from somewhere around here, could be rescued by Althar. He left the demonic bats and the rockworm parts of the story intact, but made no mention of Genero praying to Temisa to strengthen the party. Finally, he got to Mitos' death by the blade of Monsterbane. "So at last," Medinn said, "the plague of mad wizards was finally at an end. Chalmrake the Foul, Hwang, and now Mitos the Mighty, all brought low by Gan Brightblade and his noble comrades. May their names ring out forevermore as great heroes of Flingaria." The Northerners, those who were still awake, cheered loudly and banged their flagons together. Orphle was one of those who wasn't awake, to Medinn's relief, and King Tomby rose very unsteadily from his chair. "The feast is ended!" As soon as he heard those words, Medinn allowed himself to pass out. The sun shone a lot more brightly in the north. Medinn learned this when he pried his eyes open the following morning. At least, he assumed it was the following morning. The last thing he remembered was collapsing on the grassy ground in front of the main feasting table. He clambered to his feet, the sun blaring down on him from the sky. He held up his hands, blinking the spots out of his eyes. Looking around, he saw that all the tables were still there, covered with the remains of the feast, but no people aside from him. Plenty of insects buzzed about the leftover gristle and half-finished flagons, and thinking about it, Medinn figured it was their low buzzing that actually woke him up. Footfalls from behind caused him to whirl around to see someone walking toward him. Vaguely, Medinn recognized him as one of the people sitting at the far end of the king's table. He was holding a giant gourd cradled in his huge arm. "About time your lazy ass woke up. It's afternoon already." Medinn started to talk, but his mouth was so dry it came out as a croak. The man with the gourd laughed. "You Southerners just can't hold your damn ale, can you? Here." He handed the gourd to Medinn, who had to grip it with both hands. "It's water." Nodding gratefully, Medinn eagerly upended the gourd's contents into his mouth. The water gushed into his mouth and down his gullet. Nothing in his life ever tasted so wonderful. "Only one from down south who could drink our ale without looking as shitty as you look right now was Gan." Swallowing the water and placing the gourd on the ground, Medinn said, "Thank you very much, sir. Did you know Gan Brightblade?" "Of course I did, shitbrain. Who do you think helped him defeat Mitos in that crap story you told at the end?" Medinn closed his eyes and blew out a long breath. What were the odds of this happening twice in a row? "You're Bog." "Of course I am. Who'd you think I was, Althar?" "Well, I hoped you liked the story," he said lamely before hauling up the gourd to gulp more water. "Nah, it was shit. You got pretty much everything wrong, starting with Gan's sword. It wasn't called Monsterbane, I know." Medinn dropped the now empty gourd onto the ground and wiped his lips with the back of his sleeve. "Every time I leave that detail out, half the audience comes up to me afterward. I don't give a shit what your stupid southern audiences say, shitbrain. I'm telling you, he didn't call it that. Oh, and another thing. That rockworm wasn't a rockworm. It was just a rock. You barley..." Medinn took pleasure in interrupting the barbarian this time. "He thought it was a rockworm and destroyed it, I know. But I thought it best not to portray the heroes of Flingaria being idiots. Brother Genero told me in Valessa that..." "Wait, you heard this story from Genero?" "I've actually been telling the story for years." Medinn moved toward the edge of the table so he could lean against it. The water helped, but he was still pretty woozy. "But when I was in Valessa last month, Brother Genero was in the audience, and like you, he told me what I got wrong." "Yeah, well, I ain't told you all of what's wrong, but now I know why it's wrong if you got your info from Genero. Sure as shit explains why you told the story so that Gan, Althar, and the twins did all the work." Frowning, Medinn thought back over the story, and he realized that, aside from Ubarlig destroying the rockworm, all the actions in the story he told the previous night were taken by Althar, Brightblade, and the Halfling twins. Those are also the four who were now dead, murdered earlier this year in Cliff's End. Medinn had heard the story when he was last in that city-state, but had never been able to compose a proper presentation of it for bardic purposes. It was just so mundane an end for such great heroes. Let me tell you how it really happened. It started back during the Elven Wars. Mind you, I didn't get involved with any of that shit. I was up here doing some hunting. When Althar showed up in front of me, it wasn't really Althar. It was some kind of magical projection shit. He said they heard Mitos was in Shale's Haven. Shit yeah, let's go! I'd had a mad on for that stupid wizard going back years. Hell, I was still pissed about that cube you mentioned at the beginning of your story. So Althar hit me with a teleport spell, and there we all was in Treemark. It was me and Gan and Althar and Ubarlig and the twins. And General. All set to go. By the time we got to Shale's Haven, it was like you said, destroyed. I hadn't seen nothing like that since I was a kid and Siwain blew through the mountains. We just stood around for a while until Gan said, "That bastard has eluded us again, and this time he's left a charnel house behind." I looked at everyone and said, "Come on, people, we ain't letting this sorry-ass get away. It's been years, and I'm sick of this shit. Arthur, you gotta have a spell or something so we can find him." I do not have a spell, Bog. I have hundreds, as you well know. But Mitos has always been clever enough and strong enough to... That's odd. What's odd? I asked him. I'm detecting a magical trace of Mitos. He's never been careless enough to let me track him before. Yeah, well, maybe the shit-sucker's getting cocky in his old age. Let's go get him! That's when we headed out to the mountain. Mary and Nary found the hidden door, and after I pushed past the bats and drove them off, we went in. The twins found a trapdoor too, but I just jumped over it and the rest of them climbed past. Except Althar, he floated with one of his pansy-ass spells. Then that siren showed up. She didn't do shit to me, it was Gan she made all crazy. She was pretty, if you like them all wafy and skinny. Me, I like a woman with some meat on her bones, you know? But soon as she started singing, that was it. Gan whipped out that big sword of his and started flailing at us. Me and Ubarlig held him off, but we didn't want to hurt him. I mean, if it got too crazy, yeah, I'd hurt him, but this was Gan. We've been through too much shit together. I wasn't about to do nothing really bad to him. Luckily, Althar had one of his spells, and he took out the siren. Good thing, too, because another couple minutes, and I wasn't going to be able to hold back, you know? But Genero healed us all up. Gan cut me and Ubarlig both, and then I yelled out to Mitos, because I just knew the shit-sucker could hear us. "We're coming for you, Mitos! You hear me? No more of these stupid shitbrains to go doing your dirty work. We ain't leaving until we're standing over your body." Gan slapped me on the back. "Well said, my friend. Let us go and face the wizard together and slay him once and for all." He ran into the cavern, holding his sword over his head, and I ran right in next to him. There was Mitos, floating in the middle of the room. "So, Gan Brightblade, it's you. For so long I have led you around like a fool in a maze, but after all these years you have found me at last." Gan said, "Only long enough to end you once and for all, braggart." Then I said, "It ain't just Gan, it's all us. You're done, Mitos." "We shall see, shan't we?" We charged in on him, just hitting him over and over again. Althar used his spells, Mary and Nary managed to stab him in the back a couple times, but me, Gan, and Ubarlig just kept pounding him until he fell down. See, that's the thing. Everybody, no matter how big, no matter how strong, no matter how many spells they know, nothing. All of them fall down if you hit them enough times. Me, Gan, Ubarlig, we all cut Mitos more than once. And so did the twins, and Althar kept hitting him with every spell in the book, and he finally fell down. "No! I am Mitos the Mighty! I will not be defeated by you or anyone!" I stood over him. "Screw you, wizard!" Then I stabbed him in the heart until he was dead. Then Ubarlig cut his arms off, and Gan cut his head off, and the twins stole his purse. I think Genero committed his soul to Tamisa or some other stupid thing. And Althar just stood there because he was tired after all the spells. He couldn't even teleport us out. We had to walk. But it was worth it, because we finally killed Mitos. He was the last of the crazy wizards, and we beat his ass good. Part the third. Cliff's End. The day he came within sight of Cliff's End was the happiest day of Medinn's life. That was probably an exaggeration, but he was a bard. Overstatement was part of the job description. And it was likely that he was far happier, say, the day Rosen agreed to take him on as an apprentice. But after riding for 11 days through the cold, miserable Northlands, down alongside the Terrapin Cliffs, he was so grateful to reach the city that had been named for its location at the end of those cliffs that he almost leapt off his horse and kissed the ground. Not that his trip north wasn't productive. Even though he once again found himself telling the story of Brightblade's battle against Mitos in front of someone who was there for it and had criticisms, it was a most profitable trip. King Tomby and Orful were both so happy with the bard's work, the king paid Medinn double what had been originally promised. His saddlebags had been weighed down with 200 gold rather than the expected 100. Among other things, it meant that, once this birthday party for Lady Mirka was done with, he could take a small vacation. Maybe head to Saptor Isle or take a trip south. Very, very far south. As far from Bog and King Tomby and Orful as possible. That was, however, the last time he would take a commission from anyone farther north than Barlin. Those people were insane. When he arrived at the caravan terminus just outside the city-state, his first stop was a livery stable, part of a franchise that rented horses throughout Flingaria. This made it easier on Medinn, as he meant he didn't have to return the horse to Barlin and then rent another to take him to Cliff's End. It would have added 4 days to his journey, and he really didn't wish to be late for this. He loved working in Cliff's End because any gig he had there also meant he could work his way from tavern to tavern doing side gigs. For years, he'd had open invitations to perform at the Dog and Duck and the Stone Kobold. He always got big tips in Cliff's End. While returning the horse, he had one of the stable girls at the livery take a message to the castle to let Madame Brigit know that he was here and would be along shortly. Once he took care of the horse and settled his account, he walked to the castle, where he was greeted by a harried-looking halfling. "You must be Medinn?" She looked him over and wrinkled her nose. "Come with me, please. I'll show you your rooms. You can bathe, rest, and we'll have some food brought to you. Once you're cleaned up, you can see Madame Brigit." The only word that Medinn truly registered was bathe. He usually bathed once a week, like most people, but it had been the better part of a month since he'd last done so, and suspected that he needed to scrape off the grime with a short sword. Hours later, he was clean, had put on a fresh set of clothes, had eaten a meal of roasted chicken that was a welcome relief after weeks of jerky and the heavy meats of Orphal's feast, and sat across from Madame Brigit at her desk, which was filled with parchments. "The messenger said you just came from the north?" Brigit didn't even try to hide the disdain from her voice. "Yes, I had a very lucrative engagement there." "It must have been for a bard of your caliber to travel there. In any event, this will, I'm sure, be a far more civilized performance. Since you've been away for so long, you're probably not aware that Lord Blake is, no longer with us." Medinn's eyes widened. "He died? How awful for 2 straight lords of the domain to perish so close to each other." "No, but he will be dead presently. He's in a dungeon in Valessa, awaiting the carrying out of his death sentence for murdering his father and conspiring to murder the king and queen." The bard's jaw dropped open. It sounded like the scandal of a lifetime, and he missed it! He was going to need to spend some time here collecting material so he could add the story of Lord Blake's betrayal to his repertoire, if for no other reason than he fully expected it to be requested a great deal. Brigit shuffled some parchments on her desk. "Nonetheless, Lady Maker's birthday celebration will go on as planned. Lord Dorval has left the organizing of it to me, thankfully. I found that events go more smoothly when I'm left to simply do the work without constant interference. Now then, you will be the first act of the evening. There will be a performance of Zuta's latest play during dinner, followed by a gnome named KRAD who will sing, then the juggler, and then we will close with you. By that time, everyone will be tired and sated, so I suggest you limit yourself to 2 stories. Lady Mirka will wish you to tell the story of Helsik Gam's defeat at the hands of the Dragon Riders. In fact, the specific reason why she requested you for her party was because she heard you tell that story at Midsummer last year, so I suggest you lead with that." "I'm honored," Medinn said truthfully. He knew that his Midsummer performance in Jacob Park last year was attended by the Lord and Lady, but he had no idea that she was at all impressed with it. "After that, I suggest that you all ask Lord Dorval what he would like to hear." Brigit's tone throughout the conversation belied her 3 uses of the verb to suggest. These were orders, and Medinn would regret not following them. "I look forward to it, madam." "I hope so. You're the only performer I've actually seen ahead of time, so I have no idea what to expect. That's why I wish you to go last, so everyone will leave with good feelings." "Thank you, madam. As long as Lord Dorval doesn't ask for the story of how Gan Brightblade defeated Mitos the Mighty." Medinn regretted the rashly emotional words as soon as he said them, but Madame Brigit's only reply was, "I believe that is a favourite of Lord Dorval's. Or rather, it was a favourite of his brother's. I honestly don't know the new lord all that well. I've barely gotten to know Lord Blake when he was arrested. However, if you have trouble with that particular story, you should know that one of the participants will be present." Now Medinn just stared at Brigit. Barely able to form words, he managed to croak out, "Excuse me?" "General Ubarlig is now the military advisor to the Lord and Lady. He will, of course, be in attendance." It took every bit of decorum Medinn had not to bang his head on Brigit's oak desk. As it was, he swore that under no circumstances would he ever tell that stupid story ever again. The party was, as expected, amazing. After the awful ale and the strange meats of King Tomby's table, the lovingly prepared meals of the Lord and Lady's chef were heavenly, and the ale, which was cranberry-flavored, was the finest he'd ever had. The one-act play by Zuter, a playwright Medinn had always been fond of, was moderately entertaining. The actors weren't the best the Bard had seen, which hampered the performance, but the dialogue was superb as usual. The juggler wasn't bad, but what impressed Medinn most was KRAD. Gnomes weren't known for their singing voices as a general rule, but KRAD had a piercing tenor that echoed beautifully in the dining hall. Medinn was grateful that the juggler was between KRAD and him, as the gnome would be a very tough act to follow. While the juggler plied her trade, the Bard noticed a dwarf sitting at the main table. There were other dwarves present, of course, but this was the only one who seemed to be looking at everyone and everything in the room. What's more, he was like a coiled spring, ready to leap into action at a moment's notice. That just had to be Ubarlig. The juggler ended her act with an impressive bit, tossing a short sword, a weighted ball, and a small stuffed hobgoblin that she said belonged to her infant daughter. She caught all three with a flourish, bowed, and returned to her seat. Swallowing and hoping for the best, the Bard walked into the center of the room. Good evening. I am Medinn of Gravesend, and it is my pleasure on this happiest of occasions to regale you with some stories of Flingaria. I will begin by wishing Lady Mirka a very joyous birthday, and I shall commence with a story that I'm told is a favorite of hers. With that, Medinn launched into the story of the great dragon riders, led by Gamtar, Ferdin, and Jaya, who rode the mighty golden dragons through the skies of Flingaria and cast out Helsik Gam after a mighty battle over the Garaman Sea. While the applause he received after telling the story was far quieter than what he had heard in the presence of King Tumby, and more reserved than what he'd received in the slaughtered basilisk, it was enthusiastic all the same. In particular, he noticed that, for the first time this entire evening, Lady Mirka smiled. It wasn't that she seemed in any way unhappy, she just wasn't the type of person who smiled a lot. As the applause died down, he turned to face the Lord and Lady. Thank you for your kindness, my lady. Now then, my lord, do you have a particular tale you wish me to tell? Duval smiled in surprise. Apparently, Madame Brigit hadn't shared her suggestion with the lord of the domain. Oh my! Well, that's very generous of you. I shall have to think about this. He put a finger to his chin. Oh, I know. I've always loved hearing the story of how Gan Brightblade and his friends defeated Mitos the Mighty. Brightblade and several of his friends died right here in Cliff's End, as it happens, so I think it would be fitting to memorialize the occasion with that story. Somehow, Medinn managed not to scream. Wyatt had apparently fated him to tell this story in front of each of its surviving participants, whether he wanted to or not. His eyes fell on Ubarlig, whose expression had changed from that of a cautious person watching out for sudden sneak attacks to that of someone resigned to hearing something he wasn't going to like. Not willing to endure this again, Medinn tried something crazy. As it happens, one of those friends is here. Not, he added quickly, one of the ones who died, obviously. A chuckle spread throughout the room. General Ubarlig, if you'd be so kind as to step forward. The dwarf demurred at first, but the crowd went for it and egged him on. Reluctantly, Ubarlig walked to the center of the room. Reaching out an arm, Medinn said, First of all, sir, I must ask to shake your hand. Everyone in this room, in this castle, in this city-state, owes their lives to you and your friends. You are far too kind, Ubarlig said quietly. Medinn then turned to the rest of the room. I have found in my travels that while I try my best to do justice to the tales I tell, there is no substitute for hearing the story directly from one of the participants. The first rule that Rosen, my mentor, taught me was that there is no substitute for being there. That was a lie, in fact. The first thing Rosen taught him was to always drink ale before performing. So I would like to request that Ubarlig himself tell the story of how he and his friends defeated Mitos the Mighty. After all, I, for all my gifts, was not present, and I have learned over the past few months that this is a fatal flaw in my rendering of the tale. I believe that everyone here will find it a far more edifying experience coming from one of its participants. A susurrus rumbled through the crowd, building in intensity. The crowd liked the idea of hearing one of the heroes of Flingaria tell a story he was involved in. And so Medinn spared himself the ignominy of being corrected once again. I was with Gan among my people, trying to recruit more soldiers to the fight against the Elf Queen, when we received word that Mitos the Mighty had taken over Shale's Haven. It was a small village to the south of Treemark, but still filled with good people who deserved better than to live under the thumb of so foul a wizard as he. Althar Lothsirhands, that great, maddening wizard, gathered us all in Treemark with a series of teleport spells. The war against the Elf Queen had often kept us apart. Gan and I were on the front lines, as was Althar in the rebellion against his cousin. But Brother Genero preferred to avoid political conflicts. Mary and Nary preferred to avoid any sort of conflict, and Bog opined that the entire war was, in his word, stupid. But against Mitos, we were of one purpose. We had defeated him many times, and he us, but every time the job was left unfinished. Either we were able to survive his onslaught, or he ours. When we arrived at Shale's Haven, however, we were devastated. Many of you may not have heard of Shale's Haven, and this is why. Mitos' rule did not last long, as the people committed some sin or other against his vanity, and he wiped them out. Not a single soul was left alive in the town, not a single structure left unmolested. It was a monument to Mitos' madness. We stood in silence for a very long time. And then Gan said something, and Bog said something, and I truly do not recall a word they said, for all I could see were the burnt bodies of men, women, and children. I held up my Fjorm axe, the mighty weapon that Gan had gifted to me years earlier, and said, "Let us be off, and destroy this mad mage once and for all before he commits such atrocities again." "Your zeal is as impressive and useless as ever, dwarf," Althar said to me. "Mitos has always been clever enough and strong enough to hide..." "Well, that's odd." "What's odd?" I asked. "I'm detecting a magical trace of Mitos. He's never been careless enough to let me track him before." Bog said, "Yeah, well, maybe the shit-sucker's getting cocky in his old age. Let's go get him." We followed the magical trail Mitos left behind, which took us to a redoubt in the Lana Mountains. As we approached the mountain's base, Gan said, "We must be wary, my good friends. Mitos would not have chosen this mount as his base of operations if he did not fortify it." Mary said, "We're always wary, Gan." "Yeah," Mary added. "So we're still alive, ain't it?" As they spoke, the halfling twins were searching for a way in. Eventually, Mary found a hidden door, and we went inside. But we were immediately set upon by a swarm of bats intent on sucking our very life's blood. Luckily, we were able to banish them. Our weapons kept them at bay, as did Genero's prayers to Temisa. Torches lit our way through the caves under the mountain. We worked our way around the stalagmites that jutted up from the ground. At one point, we believed one to be a rockworm in disguise, but that proved to be an illusion brought about by our apprehension about what had happened at Shale's Haven. Neri found a trapdoor that would likely have killed us all, had she not found it. Had we fallen through, we would have all been impaled on spikes. Althar might have survived, and might have even arsed himself to save one or more of us, but the majority of us would have died. So it was only fitting that the fool of an elf got ensorcelled by a siren. Gan was bewitched as well, and suddenly the five of us found us confronted with our powerful comrades. It is no easy thing to take up arms against a friend, especially when that friend is not in his right mind. Compounding the difficulty was that it was never easy to take up arms against either Gan Brightblade or Althar Loth-Searhands, never mind the pair of them. Bog and I attempted to keep them at bay, but we were hamstrung by our unwillingness to harm them permanently. Well, I was, in any case. Bog became less so as the battle wore on. But the twins were able to sneak behind the siren and stab her in the back. Normally, such a thing would not have been possible, but Gan and Althar were made of sterner stuff, and even though they were under the siren's control, they fought that control every step of the way, distracting the temptress enough so that the halflings could attack. Genero healed all our wounds, and then Gan looked up at the stalactites in the ceiling. "We are coming for you, Mitos! No more shall you use minions and slaves and trickery to do your dirty work. It is you for whom we have come today. We shall not rest until your bones lay at our feet." The next room was a huge clearing carved from mountain rock. The place had been built by fine hands, as fine as that of any dwarf. Gan charged ahead against the advice of the twins. "You may want to check for traps," Mary cried out. Mary added, "Never know what will come at you." Gan called back, "Mitos has sent his minions and sprung his traps, proving that he fears us. We shall no longer be cautious, but we shall continue forward and face the evil wizard." Then Gan ran into the cavern, his sword held high over his head. We followed and saw what he did. Mitos the Mighty using his magic to float in the center, lightning bursting forth from his extremities. "So, Gan Brightblade, you and your friends have found me. I have led you all around as though you were in a maze, and now it has come to this." "Yes, braggart, we are here to kill you," Gan said. Mitos smiled. "That is what you said at the Forest of Nimvale." "Yes, and you hid behind hobgoblins. No longer shall we allow you to avoid confronting us. Now we shall defeat you forevermore." I will be honest, I have no specific recollection of what happened next. And to this day, I could not tell you how we defeated Mitos. Oh, we did what we always did. Gan, Bog, and I attacked directly with our weapons. Mary and Neri tried to attack more stealthily. Althar and Genero used the magic of either wizardry or priesthood. We'd done it before, of course, against foes powerful and feeble, great and small. Never before had we been able to defeat Mitos that way. Yet this time we were able to wear him down. It wasn't any single attack that did it, as I recall. I wounded him, Bog wounded him, Gan wounded him. Some of Althar's spells got through, so did one of Genero's, and Mary and Neri were able to stab him in the back with their daggers. Finally, suddenly, amazingly, Mitos the mage fell to the rocky floor. He ranted, he raved, he went on about how he could never be defeated. And then Gan walked up to him, saying, "The spirits of those you destroyed in Shale's Haven shall be avenged!" He raised his sword up and brought it down, beheading Mitos and ending him. There was a smattering of applause following Ubarlig's telling of the tale. Though it was far less enthusiastic than what Medinn had received for his story of the Dragon Riders, still the Bard was content. Based on Ubarlig's own vaguely interesting but surprisingly uninspiring telling, he would have joined Genero and Bog in enumerating the flaws in Medinn's own version of the story, and he simply could not have bore that a third time. As Ubarlig returned to his seat, Lord Doval was muttering, "I say, that was a bit of a disappointment. I'd always heard that Mitos was killed after the Elven Wars, and didn't Brightblade's sword have a name of some kind?" "I had once thought the same, my lord," Medinn said solicitously. "And yes, many believe that Brightblade's sword was called Monsterbane, but I'm sure the General will attest that that is a creation of myth and legend from bards such as myself." "Indeed," Ubarlig said, having retaken his seat next to a tall, skinny human noble. "Gan always felt that naming of swords was foolish." Medinn smiled. "Still, it was good to hear that from the source, as it were." Frowning, Lord Doval said, "I suppose. Rather drained the life out of the story, if you ask me." Lady Mirka next to him said, "I enjoyed it. It was free of the unnecessary floweriness that often accompanies such tales." "Well, if the lady will indulge me a bout of floweriness, I think I can entertain her son with a story of the Pirate Queen." Postscript. From the secret archives of the Brotherhood of Wizards. After a colloquy was held on the subject, it was decided that the dementia suffered by Mitos was no longer tenable. The previous colloquy on the subject was in favor of leaving Mitos to his own devices, but that was before his destruction of the entire town of Shale's Haven and its inhabitants. It was at that point that the new colloquy was called, as his actions were growing more and more dangerous, and might cause difficulties for other members of the Brotherhood of Wizards. However, after Mitos had been removed from this plane, it became clear that the elven wizard, Althar Lothsirhands, and a collection of mortals he had befriended would cause issues. They had combated Mitos in the past and were determined to find and destroy him. Althar was not part of any of the colloquies due to his obvious conflict of interest, so he was unaware of Mitos' fate. Neither he nor his mortal comrades would simply accept that Mitos was no longer an issue. So the wizard Virak agreed to disguise himself as Mitos and do battle with the 6 mortals and Althar. Several minions and other illusions were created within the Lana Mountains to distract the septet and create a proper setting for their final battle against what they believed to be Mitos. Virak created the illusion of his death most effectively. This served the function of removing Mitos from the consciousness of Flingarian citizens most effectively. Mitos is still resting comfortably in the Panzeric dimension, where he will live out the rest of his days contained. The extent of his illness will not be known outside these archives. The end. Again, that story can be found in the eSpec Books edition of Dragon Precinct, which is available, obviously, from eSpec Books, at finer online book dealers everywhere. You can check that out, as well as the rest of the series, which includes Dragon Precinct, Unicorn Precinct, Goblin Precinct, Griffin Precinct, Mermaid Precinct, Tales from Dragon Precinct, and various upcoming volumes, as well as other anthologies and collections and stuff that they're in. Find me online at DeCandido.net. Find me, read my blog at DeCandido.wordpress.com, and support me at patreon.com/krad. If you support my Patreon at $10 or more per month, one of the features is a monthly vignette featuring my original characters. I have done over half a dozen Dragon Precinct vignettes, including the story of how Helsik Cam was defeated by the Dragon Riders. So you should check that out. Anyway, thank you very much. Please vote. Please stay safe.